Hello lovely people, welcome to another edition of Book Chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently. I have 4 books to talk about this week, and let's just crack on with it.
Sophie Vlogs.
Okay, first up is Lesley Blanch, Inner Landscapes, Wilder Shores by Anne Boston. This is a biography of Lesley Blanch, who during the 30s, 40s, she did a lot of things. She was a writer. She wrote for Vogue, stuff like this. She also she was fascinated with Russian culture. So she wrote some sort of kind of histories, but fictionalized a little bit, romanticized, if you will. Later she transferred her love of Russia onto love of Middle Eastern countries instead, and she did a similar thing for histories over there. Essentially she was sort of like a public figure, but nowadays it seems like she's less well known. And this book is just looking at her and her life, because it was an interesting life. I really enjoy reading biographies of interesting women. It's just it's like a whole genre which I'm just into. I think a particularly interesting aspect of this was Lesley Blanch was married a couple of times, and one of her husbands, they had a bit of a tumultuous relationship, if you will. He was also an author, and there was just I think one of the really interesting passages of this book was looking at the way in which their relationship fed each other's creativity / stifled each other's creativity in sometimes. Because in many ways Lesley Blanch was this wonderfully capable woman. She was friends with all these horrendously famous people, and she would just take herself off and go travel and write these things and everything like that. But then in other times she was just so vulnerable. It feels weird to be this person's troubled relationship was very interesting, but it was very interesting. But it was an interesting glimpse into the life of this character who was independent and who had such a love for the romanticized view of Russia that she had, and the same with then she transferred that onto the Middle East, as I said earlier, these romanticized views, this way of she taught herself these languages so that she could look into the history and all stuff like this. She just seemed like a very interesting person, although also an emotionally complex person with flaws. That's what I took away from this. So it was interesting. I'm probably not going to keep it. Next up is The Spy by Paolo Coelho. This is my first Paolo Coelho that I've ever read. I've heard really, really good things about him. I think it's The Alchemist is his big book that people always talk about. I wasn't blown away by this one. I enjoyed it. I think I felt like it was very simplistic. I felt both in language, which is not a criticism because it is nice to have things that are quick, easy reads. That's always good. I just felt it's telling the story of Matahari, and it starts off and it's sort of and part of the book is told from her point of view while she's standing trial for being a spy during World War II, and it's her writing a letter to her daughter to explain herself and all stuff like this, and then part of it is from the point of view of her lawyer afterwards, which is filling in some blanks that she wouldn't have had the information for. It felt you could assign this book at I don't know, GCSE level, and I feel you could probably do some good, I feel like it's quite accessible to teenagers and that sort of thing, with the main driving point of this is I was just a empowered woman trying to empower myself. But I feel while he's trying to be like Matahari, she was just an empowered woman living in a time when that wasn't okay, I also felt his portrayal of her was quite simplistic and reductive at times. So if we're going to go for, she's an empowered woman who's living in a time when you weren't supposed to do X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 I feel we could have maybe explored some of the sexual politics more, because she was a dancer, but also did have affairs with many high-profile men, and so that sort of thing. I felt there was more complexity there that could have been delved into, rather than I felt we maybe were a little bit reductive at times. I have looked on Goodreads, and lots of people who are big fans of his work have also said that this isn't their favourite. So I'm not writing him off as an author. This didn't give me everything I wanted, I think. I think I wanted more of an insight into Matahari, whereas actually I think I probably got more of that from Wikipedia. Okay, and then my final 2 books sort of feed into each other. So first up is War Music by Christopher Logue, which is a retelling of books 16 and 19 of the Iliad. I actually wrote part of my dissertation on this, not very much. I looked at other books more, but I did briefly touch on this. But because it was a dissertation, you're like, I'll just read the bit I need to read. I'll like, do all the rest of my work. So it was nice to sit down and read this as a whole. It's written in like poetry form. I really enjoyed it. He really does focus on like the harsh realities of war. I wouldn't say that this is like a translation, because there are a lot of, I'd say it retains like spirit of Iliad, but you know, he's not doing a direct translation. Like there are metaphors and stuff used which, whilst they're really effective, they're not like contemporaneous with things that would have existed in that time. That's not a criticism, it's just more like an observation. I did really enjoy it. My criticism is that he does this thing where, like, when I did my dissertation on the Iliad, I was looking at the figure of Briseis, and I talked about this briefly, because I mainly talked about the fact that all of her stuff is taken out of this. We get Thetis' point of view, and then all other women are not allowed to speak in this, which is, like, my niggle, but I understand that this is sort of looking at, like, the Iliad as, you know, like, male war epic, rather than, like, let's look at some female laments right now. It's just, I love female laments. But this was really good. If you are a Iliad fan and you haven't read this, I do think it is worth a read. And then leading on from that, because I was like, oh, thinking about my dissertation, Briseis as a figure in the literary tradition morphs into Criseyde, which Chaucer and Troilus and Criseyde is like one of like a big character topic. So I finally read A Double Sorrow, Troilus and Criseyde by Lavinia Greenlaw, which is looking back at Chaucer's Troilus and Criseyde, and it's a retelling, but it does it in these little poetic fragments, if you will. So you read the whole thing as a whole. It's not like individual poems. It's telling the story, but she gives you like the line references. She's condensing the story down into these little snippets, and I found the form of this. It excited me. It was just, I just found it an interesting way to like consume this tale. So the way it's formatted, you read the first line almost like a title that like thematically influences how you read the rest of this section. Even though it flows in as one, it's not a separate thing, it's like the first line of it. It sort of was like theme, and then we explore this moment, and then we move on to the next fragment in the moment. If you're reading this and you haven't read the Chaucer and you're not really familiar with it, she does give you little things at the bottom which is like, this is what's happening right now. But as someone who is very familiar, I didn't just write my dissertation on Troilus and Criseyde, I also did a medieval romance module and I wrote an essay on it. So I'm like hecka familiar with that text. And I really enjoyed picking up on, oh, you can tell this little snippet of poetry is influenced by like this metaphor we had, or like, oh, here's this moment being played out for us. And what I really appreciate about the original Chaucer text is the nuance with which it allows you to view both Troilus and Criseyde, which in later literature is often lost, because Criseyde is viewed as this like false woman, and she becomes like an archetype rather than a character. But when you go back to the original Chaucer text, she's allowed nuance, Troilus is allowed nuance. Criseyde isn't completely false, because as soon as she fucks off, Troilus immediately starts to doubt her. Like, there's falseness on both sides, and there's also loyalty on both sides, and there's this, that's what makes it so heartbreaking. It's like this doomed lovers. If you're not familiar with them, it's very like Romeo and Juliet. Like, Troilus is a Trojan prince, Criseyde is the daughter of this Trojan priest who has defected to the Greek side because he knows that the Greeks will win the Trojan War, and they fall in love, and eventually, like, Criseyde's father arranges a prisoner exchange, and she goes back over to the Greek side, and it's like, will she maintain faithfulness to Troilus? No, she doesn't, but it's understandable because she's a transported woman existing in an enemy camp and she has no power, etc. So I really enjoyed this, as it was very quick read, because it is just tiny little bloop bloops. Tiny little bloop bloops, that's a technical term. But I just thought this was a really lovely way of retelling it. It also has a really gorgeous cover, which I enjoyed. But this, as we can tell, I've ended on a high. I had actually read a Lavinia Greenlaw book before, which was The Importance of Music for Girls, and I didn't like it. I just found it really hard to connect to. Whereas this one, loved it. So yes, those are all my recent reads. I hope that you've been having some lovely reading times lately. Please do let me know what they've been. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of these if you have any. Other than that, I'll see you next week for something different.